Hi, I'm Jerry the King Lawler, WWE Hall of Famer Jerry the King Lawler, and you, my friend, are watching another original wrestling documentary.
James Harris, also known as Sugar Bear Harris, Big Jim Harris, Kamala the Ugandan Giant, and later the Ugandan Headhunter, was a professional wrestler who debuted in 1978 when he was hired by Bill Watts under his NWA Tri-State territory. Throughout his career, he would appear in over a dozen promotions, including WWF and WCW. Born in 1950 in Mississippi, James experienced racism at an early age and would throughout most of his life at different levels. By the early 2000s, he was only making sporadic appearances, and his last match was on August 15, 2010 at a Juggalo Championship Wrestling event. The following year, his health took a downward spiral as he had his left leg amputated below the knee due to complications of high blood pressure and diabetes. He would fight the condition over the next decade. After losing his right leg and ultimately succumbing to COVID-19 in August 2020 at the age of 70. This is the story of James Harris, aka Kamala the Ugandan Headhunter. James was born on May 28, 1950 in Senatobia, Mississippi. He was one of 6 children. While by this time most children were born in a hospital, James was born in a cabin on a plantation in Senatobia where his mother and father worked as sharecroppers. His father, Jesse Harris, was killed during a dice game during a gambling dispute when James was only 4 years old. Because racism was very prevalent at that time, his murder went virtually uninvestigated and subsequently unsolved, which would impact James for his entire life. Growing up in a rough area of town, which was very much segregated and raised by a single parent, his mother would remarry and move the family to nearby Coldwater, 30 miles south of Memphis. James grew up in a world that still had separate bathrooms for blacks and whites, and had no signs of equality anywhere. African Americans were treated with disrespect everywhere they went, and would have to answer to whites with yes sir and no sir, even if they were younger. James knew this wasn't how the world really was, as one day white insurance salesman came from New York, and when his mother called the 18-year-old sir, he would reply, "Ma'am, you don't need to call us that." James knew that the world outside his small bubble was much different. As James got older, he became a sharecropper himself, picking cotton and growing corn. Any money he made was used to help the family, who barely made enough to carve out a living. No matter how much he made, his cost always outweighed the profits, but James would do his best to remain positive. He attended Coldwater Elementary, but his home life was no picnic. With constant fighting and arguing because bad harvests threatened the family finances, his mother and stepfather's relationship turned into a physical one. His mother was a tough woman, and during physical altercations, she would regularly get the best of his stepdad, including even beating him with a window stick. Once the physical melee was done, she sat down calmly and took a sip out of her wine. In grade 8, James would join the football team. His coach would describe him as a big sweet guy with a good attitude and nicknamed him Sugar Bear, already tipping the scales at over 275 pounds. Even though he was a lot larger than other students, he still got bullied and lost most of the fights he was in simply because he just didn't fight back because he was worried people might start hating him. Until one day he stood up to one of the bullies in math class and knocked his desk over with him in it. From that point on, James would stand up for himself and began to earn the respect of his peers. James made it to the 9th grade and dropped out. As a farmer, he saw no use in continuing and felt he was wasting his days in a classroom. He had big dreams of owning his own farm, but while his ambitions were high, James fell into a life of petty crime in order to fill his empty stomach. Between harvests, sometimes there was not enough food to go around and he began stealing, which, being African American in the mid-60s in Mississippi, could lead to a death sentence if caught. Normally the police would shoot first and ask questions last. He broke into the high school cafeteria and stole a few dozen cookies and some change that was left in the register. After committing more serious thefts such as shoplifting and stealing from other farmers, James broke into a house. But because Coldwater was such a small town, it didn't take long until rumors turned into accusations and James got a stern warning by an overzealous cop that he better leave town. Because of the racial tension between white police officers and African Americans, James decided to take the threat seriously, and at the advice of his former football coach, he went to work on a farm in Florida. At the age of 17, with his 9th grade education, he packed a single bag and headed to Florida, ended his life of crime, and never looked back. He began working on a farm in Florida, picking fruit where he was paid $1 an hour plus room and board. When he wasn't working or fishing, his escape would be the Monday night wrestling matches at the West Palm Beach Auditorium. Watching wrestlers like Eddie Graham and the Great Malenko, he was hooked instantly. He became an addict and would attend the Monday night wrestling matches religiously. Watching stars in the early 70s from Dusty Rhodes to Thunderbolt Patterson to Terry Funk, James couldn't get enough. At 18 years old, after saving his money from working on the farm, picking up overtime hours when he could, and even began shooting dice, he bought his first car, a 1958 black Oldsmobile. Eventually, James learned how to fix small engines and learned about construction, opening up more opportunities for him, and he left the farm. Now 19 years old and over 300 pounds, he moved into a rooming house. He would eventually get a job as a roofer and even open up his own company. But James was homesick and moved back to Mississippi for a short time. But when he realized the job opportunities were limited, he moved to Michigan and began driving truck for a living. One of his co-workers happened to know where Bobo Brazil lived, and after convincing James his size might be his ticket into the business, they dropped by Bobo Brazil's house. Bobo wasn't home at the time, but his wife told him to go see Tiny Tim Hampton. Because of James' easygoing and humble personality, they hit it off immediately, and he began his training. Eventually, Bobo Brazil returned from touring, and they both trained James. Because James was an experienced truck driver, he became the designated driver for both Bobo and Tiny Tim. At the time, they were both performing on and off for Vince McMahon Sr. in the WWF. Although James loved wrestling, he didn't see himself as a wrestler and just looked at it as a job he could make some quick money and move back home. After countless training sessions, he still hadn't been informed the match results were predetermined. The entire time in his early training, James assumed everything was all real. Eventually, James started setting up the ring in the local promotion in exchange for front row tickets where he would watch Bobo Brazil battle the Sheik in the main event. After he saw the Sheik thanking Bobo for a great match afterwards, Bobo let him in on the secret of pro wrestling. Not liking Michigan winters, James decided to rekindle his relationship with an ex-girlfriend and headed to Arkansas. He continued his training with veteran Mario Gelanto, who began training James in the psychology of the business as well as timing, and how to make his easygoing, friendly personality into a vicious monster in the ring. Early in his career, James decided being a villain in the ring was the right fit for him. In 1978, he was ready for his first match, which was against the Great Mephisto to a small TV crowd in Greenwood, Mississippi. He joined International Championship Wrestling, which ran the state of Mississippi, owned by George Curtis Culkin and his son Gil. Their television show aired Friday nights throughout the entire state. Not quite considered an outlaw territory, the ICW were members of the AWA, where Nick Bockwinkel defended his title several times. His first match ended up in a double DQ. Sugar Bear Harris was born. The Great Mephisto took James under his wing. Some of his first opponents included Tom Boogaloo Shaft, Pork Chop Cash, and Donnie Fargo. Now 28 years old, James was on his way, had one goal in mind: perfecting his craft. He would later become managed by Percy Pringle and drafted into his stable of heels, where he would change his name to Ugly Bear Harris. But that name wouldn't last long. He would use others such as Big Jim Harris, the Mississippi Mauler, and Bad Leroy Brown. James would bounce around a few smaller promotions and land in Leroy McGurk's Tri-State Wrestling, where he was managed by Izzy Slapowitz. He also met future WWE Hall of Famer Jim Ross, who advised James to try and travel around as much as he could. It wasn't easy for African American professional wrestlers in this era, as most promotions would limit their card to only one or two. In the South, being a black wrestler was a gimmick in itself. James won his first championship in NWA Tri-State in 1979, teaming with Oki Shikina to win the NWA Tri-State Tag Team Championship. In early 1980, he packed his bags and headed to Mexico, where most of the wrestlers were much smaller, making him a special attraction on the card. He regularly worked 3 shows per day, which was possible south of the border. After 6 months of bad payoffs in Mexico, James headed back to the US and landed in Southeastern Championship Wrestling as Bad News Harris, winning the NWA Southeastern Heavyweight Championship. In 1981, James traveled to Europe for seasoning. Following a stint in Germany, he traveled to the United Kingdom, where he wrestled for joint promotions as the Mississippi Mauler, a character with some similarities to his future Kamala character. In June 1981, he competed in a tournament for the vacant WWA World Heavyweight Championship, losing to Wayne Bridges in the final in Wembley Arena in London. After Japanese promoters got a look at James, they planned to bring him over to face Giant Baba, but Abdullah the Butcher was already established in Japan and threw cold water on it. James had established the Mississippi Mauler gimmick based on the Missouri Mauler Larry Hamilton, which James watched as a fan. His Mississippi Mauler was similar to the Kamala gimmick, which would bring him worldwide fame later on in his career. Ironically, Larry Hamilton was an outspoken racist and a card-carrying member of the KKK. In late 1981, James even made a short tour of Africa along with his fellow UK performers. He landed back in the United Kingdom, but that tour would be cut short after he broke his ankle. In early 1982, still nursing his broken ankle, James headed back to the US and began looking for a truck driving job. But jobs driving truck were few and far between. He decided to go visit his friend, the Dream Machine Troy Graham, at a CWA wrestling show in Memphis, and upon entering the locker room ran into Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett. Fresh off the Andy Kaufman angle, ratings were hot and they were looking for a big man to keep the momentum going. Jerry Lawler took one look at James and saw dollar signs. Even though he still had a cast on his ankle for another month, negotiations began. Jerry Lawler instructed James to leave the arena as he didn't want any of the fans to see him, just yet. Jerry Lawler, being a comic book fanatic, offered James a role of a face-painted Ugandan cannibal. James didn't even have to think it over and told Lawler right away he would take on the role. The character was a vicious headhunter with a face and body paint copied from a Frank Frazetta painting. His backstory was that he was the former bodyguard of the president of Uganda who had been discovered by J.J. Dillon during an excursion to Africa. A promotional vignette aired on WMC TV featuring a spear-wielding Kamala seemingly emerging from a steamy African jungle. The vignette was actually filmed at Jarrett's farm in Henderson, Tennessee, with the steam effect created using dry ice, complete with one of Jerry Jarrett's wife's hoop earrings through his nose and an African mask he had hanging on his wall. The name Kamala was taken straight out of a National Geographic magazine named after Dr. Kamala, a researcher in Uganda. To establish Kamala as a monstrous character, Jarrett and Lawler instructed him to wrestle in a brawling style, with chops and biting, and to never perform any traditional wrestling moves. Instead of 24 days to heal his ankle, James had 24 hours, cutting his cast off with a drywall knife. To preserve kayfabe, James refused to speak English while in public in Memphis. Kamala made his debut in the CWA in May 1982 with Dillon as his manager. Within 2 weeks, he was in the main event, losing to Lawler by disqualification in a match that sold out the Mid-South Coliseum. In June, he defeated Lawler for the Southern Heavyweight Championship, which he held until August of that year. With J.J. Dillon busy with other commitments, James was paired with Buddy Wayne, who portrayed the original Friday character. Jerry Lawler would tap into the racist fans they performed in front of. In James's book, Kamala Speaks, he would state, Lawler wasn't racist at all. However, a racist joke dropped in the right place would show how smart Lawler is. Any cheap heat racist shots at my expense were always first earlier mentioned to me in the locker room, and I almost always gave them my blessing. According to James, racist humor didn't bother him, but racist promoters wanting to pay him less because he was African American was a whole other story. Jimmy Hart would add Kamala to his first family while he feuded with Dutch Mantel. Toward the end of the year, he feuded with imposter Kamala too. When James left Memphis, he also left behind his face painter Jerry Lawler. He would change the design from a big star on the top of his head to a design that was easier for him to apply himself. In late 1982, Kamala began wrestling for Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling promotion. He was managed by Skandar Akbar and Friday, now portrayed by Frank Dalton, forming part of Akbar's villainous Devastation Inc. stable. In April 1983, he wrestled Andre the Giant to a highly promoted bout at the Louisiana Superdome. During 1983, he also faced a Junkyard Dog in a series of Battle of the Monsters matches. The biggest money James ever made during his career was during this time with Mid-South Wrestling and his feud with the Junkyard Dog. Before leaving, he would have legendary feuds with Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Dr. Death Steve Williams. In March of 1983, Kamala, along with Friday and Skandar Akbar, made their way to Dallas and debuted in Fritz von Erich's World-Class Championship Wrestling promotion. His first match in the Sportatorium was a sellout. In October of that year, he challenged Harley Race for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, losing by disqualification. In the same month, he began a lengthy feud with the Von Erich family, repeatedly facing brothers David, Kerry, and Kevin. In May 1984, he faced the Great Kabuki at the David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions, a tribute to David Von Erich, who had died suddenly in February. In late 1983, James put a down payment on his first house and started dating a neighbor who lived nearby. They would stay together until 2003. During this time, he would regularly team up with the Missing Link and became very close friends. In March of 1984, Kamala faced Bruiser Brody in a steel cage match. Both men were paid $3,000, which sold out weeks before the event, without any notice. Kamala debuted in the World Wrestling Federation in July of that year. He was managed by Freddie Blassie, and Friday, first played by Frank Dalton, then Steve Lombardi. In a segment on the television program Tuesday Night Titans, Kamala seemingly devoured a live chicken with a cutaway shot of feathers flying out of his mouth shown to create the illusion. After defeating a series of opponents including B. Brian Blair, Salvatore Bellomo, and Chief Jay Strongbow, in August 1984, Kamala challenged Hulk Hogan for the WWF World Heavyweight Championship, wrestling him to a double countout. In October of 1984, he began a series of matches against Andre the Giant, among them a steel cage match which he lost after Andre twice sat on his chest. Due to Andre's rough treatment of him, he began carrying a gun and a pocket sewn into his trunks. After a few matches with the gun in his tights and hurting him when he took bumps, he began carrying a knife instead, which is a ritual he would continue for the next 15 years. James made it clear to Andre he wasn't going to put up with that type of treatment, and Andre apologized and worked light with him from then on. They had matches all over the world without any problems. Kamala's final appearance during that run in the WWF was in a battle royal in November of 1984. After leaving the WWF later that year, Kamala went on to appear with multiple promotions throughout the United States and Canada. Throughout 1985, he wrestled for the Minneapolis, Minnesota-based American Wrestling Association. He was established as a monster by winning a series of handicap matches. He feuded with Sergeant Slaughter, whom he had defeated in a Ugandan death match in April of 1985, but lost in a boot camp steel cage match in June. At the Superclass Supercard in September 1985, Kamala lost to Jerry Blackwell in a body slam challenge. Toward the end of the year, Kamala repeatedly challenged Rick Martel for the AWA World Heavyweight Championship, but failed to win the title. In that same year, Kamala wrestled for Jim Crockett Promotions at the Great American Bash, unsuccessfully challenging Magnum TA for the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship. In November of that same year, Kamala made his first tour of Japan with All Japan Pro Wrestling. Wrestling as Giant Kamala, he formed a tag team with King Cobra. He made his second tour in February 1986 as Kamala, and in early 1986 he also had a short run in the Montreal, Quebec, Canada-based international wrestling promotion, where he was managed by Eddie Creechman. Now on good terms with Andre, the Giant put in a good word to Vince, and Kamala returned to the WWF in July 1986, now managed by the Wizard Curtis Iakea and the mask handler Kimchi instead of Friday, portrayed by Steve Lombardi. From November 1986 to February 1987, Kamala faced Hulk Hogan in a series of matches for the WWF World Heavyweight Championship, marking the pinnacle of his career. In February 1987, he began a feud with Jake Roberts, during which Roberts repeatedly exploited Kamala's fear of snakes. In April 1987, the Wizard sold Kamala's managerial contract to Mr. Fuji, and he began teaming with Sika the Wild Samoan, who was being paid a lot more than Kamala. Although he was on national TV each week, he was still falling behind on his bills. When he first started feuding with Hogan, he would be paid sometimes $10,000 to $12,000 per match, and was able to stay in a decent room, eat a decent dinner, and still send 99% of his money home. But as he dropped down the card, payoffs were as low as a few $100s a match. By the time he paid his travel expenses, he was sharing rooms or even sleeping in his rental car to save money. The last straw was when he was told he would be performing at WrestleMania 3, but when he showed up, he was told there was no spot for him. James abruptly left the WWF once more in September 1987 over frustrations about his pay. After this run with the Federation, James opened up an arcade and also sponsored a local baseball team called Kamala Zulus. Kamala then returned to World Class Championship Wrestling, where he would make more money than being showcased on a national stage. He feuded with Kevin and Kerry Von Erich as well as Michael Hayes before the promotion shut down in 1989, and he returned to All Japan Pro Wrestling with Abdullah the Butcher. From 1990 to 1991, he worked for CMLL in Mexico. He lost to Mil Mascaras in a cage match on March 17, 1991. When he left the promotion and tried to cash a check, it was no good. After the death of Bruiser Brody, he swore to never go back. He then returned to Japan, working for All Japan, Wrestling International New Generations, and Super World of Sports into 1992. He also appeared in the Memphis-based United States Wrestling Association in 1990, feuding with Jerry Lawler and winning the USWA Unified World Heavyweight Championship 4 times, eventually losing it for the final time to Koko B. Ware. He left the company in 1992. He would remain friends with Koko B. Ware throughout the rest of his life. Kamala again returned to the WWF on May 9, 1992, with Kim Chi and Harvey Whippleman acting as his managers, and this time the office withholding 15% of his pay in an escrow account until the end of his contract to prevent him from leaving abruptly. In June 1992, he unsuccessfully challenged Randy Savage for the WWF World Heavyweight Championship. Throughout mid-1992, he wrestled primarily in house shows with his regular opponents including The Undertaker, Bret Hart, the Texas Tornado, and the Ultimate Warrior. Since the Warrior had a limo as part of his contract and knew James wasn't making much money, he insisted he ride with him instead of renting a car, and often paid for his hotel room as well. Kamala lost to The Undertaker by disqualification at SummerSlam in August 1992. He later claimed he was paid $13,000 for the bout, while The Undertaker was paid $500,000. Even though this was his biggest payday for a match, he couldn't help to think how it paled in comparison for what The Undertaker was making. Dave Meltzer questioned this claim, saying, "I'm not saying he's lying, but it's hard to believe." In November 1992, Kamala lost to The Undertaker at Survivor Series in the first ever televised casket match. In January 1993, Kim Chi and Harvey Whippleman began mistreating Kamala, leading him to break away from them and align himself with Reverend Slick. Beginning in 1993, James wrote, performed, and produced his own music. He wrote over 100 songs. Some discuss his frustration with the working conditions he experienced in the wrestling industry, most notably the low pay. He released his debut album, The Best of Kamala Volume 1, through his official website. The album features a ballad dedicated to the memory of Stanley Tookie Williams. Slick sent out to humanize Kamala, leading to a series of skits in which he introduced him to activities such as 10-pin bowling. Kamala feuded with Kim Chi throughout early 1993. In March of that year, he began a series of matches with Bam Bam Bigelow. The two were scheduled to face one another at WrestleMania 9, but the match was cancelled. In May of that year, Kamala lost a King of the Ring tournament qualifying match via countout to Mr. Hughes on an episode of WWF Wrestling Challenge. He went on to compete primarily at house shows until being released by the WWF that July. After his WWF release became official later that month, he received his 15% of his pay that was being withheld plus interest. Following his WWF run, James stepped back from professional wrestling. He began working as a truck driver using 2 semi-truck trailers he had purchased following his payout from the WWF. In December 1993, he was announced as a participant in the 1994 Royal Rumble match. However, during the bout, the announcers noted that Virgil, as an alternate participant, had replaced him. At that point, he was only wrestling in independent shows and part-time for the USWA. In December of 1993, he wrestled in India where he won the vacated IAW Tag Team titles with Dusty Wolf, defeating Leo Burke and the Mongolian Mauler. At Hulk Hogan's suggestion, Kamala joined World Championship Wrestling in 1995. He was introduced as part of Kevin Sullivan's Dungeon of Doom stable, whose goal was to end Hulk Hogan's career. His first WCW pay-per-view appearance, he defeated Hacksaw Jim Duggan at Bash at the Beach. He then lost a singles match to Hogan at the Clash of Champions. He was part of the Dungeon of Doom team at Fall Brawl, which lost to Hogan's team, the Hulkamaniacs. He was only being paid $500 per appearance, and unlike many former WWF stars, did not receive a lucrative contract. After Hulk Hogan spoke with Eric Bischoff, he was bumped up to $800, but Bischoff told him to never have Hulk call him again. After a few more dates, James let Hulk know he was leaving. Hulk offered to call Bischoff again, but James declined. He went back to driving truck where he was making $500 to $1,000 per day doing local deliveries. That same year, Frank Dalton, who played Friday in Kamala's earlier career, passed away. On January 24, 1996, Kamala returned to the USWA for the final time, where he teamed with Brian Christopher in PG-13 to defeat Tracy Smothers, Doug Gilbert, Jesse James Armstrong, and Robert Gibson in an Ironman match. In 1998, he made several appearances in ECW, but was never under contract. Kamala participated in the Gimmick Battle Royal at WrestleMania 17 and was eliminated by Sergeant Slaughter. On July 26, 2004, he made a surprise return to World Wrestling Entertainment, participating in a Raw Diva Search segment, in which the female contestants were instructed to try and seduce him. He lost to Jim Duggan at Wrestle Reunion 1 on January 29, 2005. He then faced Randy Orton on the August 11, 2005 edition of SmackDown, accompanied by Kimchi, but the match was interrupted by a message from The Undertaker to Orton, and ended in a no contest. Kamala appeared at the 2005 Taboo Tuesday event as one of the choices for Eugene's tag team partner. He lost the fan vote to Jimmy Snuka, but came to the ring after the match to deliver a big splash to Tyson Tomko. He was paid just $400. Although they reached out to him on multiple occasions to make more appearances, he declined as it was no longer worth his time and the novelty of being in the WWF was gone. Although he initially signed a Legends deal, when the contract expired, he never re-signed. On September 30th, 2006, he wrestled to a no finish with Bryan Danielson in a match for the Ring of Honor World Championship at a National Wrestling Alliance event in Bridgeport, Connecticut in front of 40 fans. He then defeated Lanny Poffo at a Great North Wrestling Super Show at the Ottawa Super Show in Ottawa, Canada. Kamala then appeared at Total Nonstop Action Wrestling Slammiversary pay-per-view in June 2008 as a guest at Jay Lethal and SoCal Val's Storyline Wedding. His last match was on August 15, 2010 at Juggalo Championship Wrestling, with the Weedman defeating the Haters. On November 7, 2011, James had his left leg amputated below the knee due to complications of high blood pressure and diabetes, a condition he had since 1992, which forced him to retire because he did not accept dialysis treatment. In April 2012, his right leg was also amputated below the knee, and a campaign was launched seeking donations to cover his financial needs. Coco Beware bought him a high-powered scooter wheelchair so he could get around. James told the Bleacher Report in 2014 that he relied on a disability check, sold handmade wooden chairs, and had written a book about his life, Kamala Speaks. In July 2016, James was named as part of a class action lawsuit filed against WWE, which alleged that wrestlers incurred traumatic brain injuries during their tenure and the company concealed the risks of injury. The lawsuit was dismissed by the District of Connecticut Judge Vanessa Lynn Bryrant in December of 2018. Mike Johnson of Pro Wrestling Insider wrote that his involvement in the lawsuit likely prevented WWE from inducting him into their Hall of Fame. On November 19, 2017, James underwent life-saving emergency surgery to clear fluid from around his heart and lungs at a hospital in Oxford, Mississippi. He was then on life support due to complications. The next day, his stepdaughter said that he showed signs of improvement but remained on life support. On November 22nd, it was reported he was able to breathe on his own, yet was unable to talk and remained under intensive care. On August 5, 2020, James tested positive for COVID-19 and was hospitalized. His wife said he likely contracted it from one of his numerous visits to the dialysis center. Due to COVID-19, he started to experience complications from his diabetes. He went into cardiac arrest on August 9, 2020, before dying later that afternoon at the age of 70. His mother was a huge wrestling fan and believed wrestling was real her entire life. She passed away in 1998, and James never had the heart to tell her differently. His final resting place is in the Simon Chapel Cemetery, Sardis, Panola County, Mississippi.
Drift away all of the pain, but it seems